Stick around to see me attempt to transform. There's no point driving a 20-valve Italian Stallion if the badges boasting that look like they're made from stale Play-Doh, so stick around to see me attempt to transform a trio of tired old Fiat items to somewhere near their old school former glory. With options limited in terms of replacement items, thought I'd give turning these 25-year-old ones around a go myself, and while I did consider doing it off camera in case it went belly up, couldn't afford to let a bit of top tier faffrey like this go to waste, so enjoy what isn't in any way, shape or form intended to be a professional how-to, but rather an impromptu me-do.
Boom.
It wouldn't be a relatively straightforward job on an old Italian car without being given the runaround, so after a fair bit of interior disassembly, which to be fair I was doing anyway to get the leaky sunroof out for a reseal, could get to the nuts securing the B-pillar trim, which is what the unsightly side emblems were both stuck and additionally secured to from behind.
Ugh.
The crudely colour-coded bonnet badge was a bit more straightforward, with a single nut being accessed from underneath, and while Babyliss hairdryer heat and dental floss jiggery pokery was also required to free it from the sticky stuff below, I didn't have to remove the engine or gearbox to do that, so couldn't really complain. After popping off the factory fixings from the rear of the pillar trims, the plastic pinned side emblems were then teased off the surface of those with some heat, floss, a screwy handle and my fingers, which were really going to be put to the test here. And because I'd be dusting these painted metal items over with some satin black a bit later down the line, as over time the badges had left unsightly ghosting beyond their outer edges, thought nothing of mechanically sanding some of the residue back before committing to chemically cutting through the rest of it with a dedicated adhesive remover. They were then uniformly sanded back, and while being metal it would have been a prime candidate for powder coating, this was more of a budget DIY job, but I was happy to learn that they were a solid piece of tin rather than cheapo plastic, which means they can technically be professionally refinished rather than just dressed and replenished, which, let's face it, never truly lasts. So spent 5 or 10 minutes rubbing things up the wrong way with what I had to hand, which admittedly wasn't much, but was still enough I felt for a basic rattle can job. It was then the turn of the small side emblems to be rubbed down to remove the rough layers of cack-handedly applied touch-up paint, so I could go on to hopefully more meticulously apply some of my own, which I'm not gonna lie was quite the time-consuming faff, but the fact they came apart helped, as it would have been a right nightmare to attempt with the items as one complete piece, so spent some time thumbing things over with my comparatively fat but still fairly dexterous digits, sanding the plastic bits back until they looked and felt fairly smooth, but refraining from getting too heavy-handed with them so as not to create any flat spots. While it looked like the front badge had previously been masked up and sprayed red, whatever had been used was now degraded and in need of stripping back, so cut a few thin abrasive strips to sand through the in-between bits with, working them back and forth from each end, as well as folded under my finger from above while the badge was secured in a vise, which again was a bit of a tedious fiddle, but aside from the edges of the chrome bars being dulled a little bit, which I figured could be rectified with a post-paint polish, proved to work quite well. So although I had initially planned on spraying the badges, decided to brush them over by hand instead, as my local model shop assured me this acrylic stuff would both adhere and flow. So after securing each piece to a matchstick, got to work with a relatively fine brush, applying an initial layer of both gloss red to the digits and metallic silver to the swooshes, which was by no means an exact match for the other limited edition titanium grey bits on the car, but would do for a basic refresh job. Not worrying too much about the quality of the finish at this point, as I'd be going back over with a second more substantial coat to plump things up later. And while admittedly I'm no basement dwelling miniature orc painter, I did tart up a few Airfix Spitfires as a kid, so figured I should have steady enough hands as an adult to get a few emblems adequately colour coded. And once they initially had been, were subsequently plonked in a bit of Play-Doh to dry. Now, although I really don't like rattle canning, I had picked up some primer and satin black to try and refresh the trim on which the freshly glossified side emblems would sit, so went ahead and first primed the freshly rubbed down items in preparation for some splattery black paint, treating each piece to 2 generous coats before going on to rub them down with a fine abrasive off camera to smooth the finish. Although looking back, I probably should have just left it as it sat, as the more texture the better for disguising imperfections beneath. It was then back to the badges for a second coat of Space Marine blood, this time dabbing it on with a loaded brush in far more generous fashion, which all but eliminates the likelihood of unsightly strokes being left behind, but does increase the risk of runs and gloops forming around the edges, especially when working at awkward angles to get the process filmed for your non-shaky handed viewing pleasure. But I think I just about got away with that for the most part here, obtaining a nice full lacquer-worthy finish for all of the plastic pieces with a bit of quiet breath-holding time spent on each. Although the side emblems thankfully didn't need masking up, the bonnet badge technically did, so initially covered the shiny slats with thin Tamiya tape off camera so I could then fill the bits in between with paint on camera, which, rightly or wrongly, I did quite liberally from the get-go. And while this item probably should have been sprayed, the 20 valve turbo bits look fine for their brush over, so thought I'd give this main badge an unashamed finger fettle too, which included a bit of untaped freehand to combat the mask bleed along the inner edges. And while I'm including these first attempt shots to illustrate the process, as they're the only ones I captured of the actual colouring, did end up completely redoing it off camera so I could manoeuvre a bit more freely and obtain a slightly tighter finish that, while being far from factory fresh, would still be a bit closer to the classic red enamel badges of old. While the badges were drying, I returned to the pillar trim to get that sufficiently sprayed up with some satin black in an old greenhouse of all places, which actually worked quite well as an impromptu spray booth, laying down 3 coats over the course of a day. And while doing this would create an obvious mismatch between the neighbouring door handle trim, couldn't be pinning freshly recoloured emblems back onto a faded finish. And although pikey painting like this always puts me on edge, do still think a bit of periodic rattle canning helps keep you grounded and prevents you getting too big for your sliders. With the pillar trims now taking root in the greenhouse, cracked open a pot of clear lacquer to hopefully add some hardy protection and additional gloss to the painted bits that were now about as dry as they were ever gonna be, which was a pretty straightforward affair and probably the most satisfying part of the process, as it allowed me to finally see a bit of light at the end of the tedious tunnel, even if it was of the artificially strip-lit variety. And although what I applied here likely would have been sufficient, did go on to dab over a second coat off camera just for good measure. And pretty much the same went for the main front badge, whose chrome plastic bars I did consider fully coating over, but for the most part left untouched so they could continue to catch the light in the same way they had for the last 25 years. Then, aside from putting everything to one side to harden for a few days while I went on to type up this script, for the fiddly brushwork at least, that was thankfully that. So the side emblems were subsequently dematchsticked, forcibly reassembled, which wasn't pretty, and taped up with tiny bits of double-sided VHB off camera. But I did try and capture them being stuck back onto the freshly sprayed pillar trim, making use of a soft microfiber towel to press them into place. As despite having had 3 days to harden, noticed some fingerprints in the finish from reassembly, which I didn't want to inflict any more of. Then, once adhered to the front, were secured as best they could be with the old metal retainers from behind, which, after being pressed down with a screwy, seemed to hold the weight of the metal trim fine, so figured wouldn't let the plastic emblems fly off anytime soon. But before bolting them or the similarly taped up bonnet badge back onto the car, went ahead and treated it to a routine maintenance wash first, to ensure everything would look spick and span for the aftershots, focusing in on the dusty cavities behind where the pillar trim sits, as well as the bonnet recess, which, after being dried off, was also thoroughly machine polished around to ensure maximum glossy impact for that area, as the repainted fire engine red badge was undoubtedly going to serve to draw the eye. Believe it or not, despite everything you've just seen, I'm not actually a fan of the side emblems, as I think they look too cartoonish and interrupt the flow of the car's otherwise slash-cut style, so would ideally prefer to delete them altogether, but for the time being would still prefer the only exterior signifier of rocket ship spec to be bright and glossy rather than faded and flaky, and that went for the front badge too, even if that did mean a bit of a handcrafted finish. Now, having faffed with and stared at the badges for so long, I'd lost the ability to tell if it was genuinely a job well done or half-arsed bodge by this point, so you'll have to let me know your thoughts in the comments below, as well as whether you've come across my missing bit of silver swoosh on your travels. But for now at least, that was trampy badge transformation well and truly ticked off the list.